Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you to the National Gallery. I'm Rusty Powell, the director, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the annual Elson Lecture, which is actually not a lecture, which is going to be a conversation. I'd also like you to take these and turn them off, please, if you would. Thank you. All right? Perfect. That's a duty. This afternoon is devoted to a very distinguished contemporary artist, which all of this series is devoted to, really, but especially today we're very pleased to have with us the artist Glenn Ligon, who will be in conversation with Molly Donovan and James Meyer, both associate curators of modern art here at the gallery. Born in the Bronx in 1960, Glenn received a BA from Wesleyan University in 1982 and participated in the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program in 1985. He has received numerous awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship in 2003 and the Skowhegan Medal for Painting in 2006. The mid-career respective Glenn Ligon America, organized by the Whitney, received the International Art Critics Award in 2012. In addition to making extraordinarily wonderful art, he also writes about it and has collaborated with curators on special exhibitions. He lives and works in New York and has been especially generous to the National Gallery of Art. We have his work represented in all aspects of our modern collections, and most notably and most recently, the Double America, which is at the entrance to the Concourse Gallery, is very new to the gallery, and we are very pleased and honored. So would you please welcome Mr. Ligon and Molly and James.
We're on stage.
Yes.
Well, we want to start out with I'm a Man. It's such an important work of yours, and it was such a really key acquisition for the National Gallery to make this past fall, and we're intensely proud of this recent acquisition. So we wanted to talk about how you made this work, which was such a breakthrough for you. The first work in which you incorporated selected text into your work. And so to do that, so that we could understand how it might have been made, and to give you a little view, a reminder of how you might have made it, because since it was done in 1988, which was some time ago, we X-rayed it. And this is what we found. We found that we couldn't see what was behind the painting, because we know from talking to you that you painted this work on top of another work, an earlier painting from your time when you were essentially an abstract expressionist painter.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what we learned when we tried to X-ray it was that because of the zinc white in the white ground of I Am a Man, it prevented us from seeing into the understructure. But what we could tell was that you had painted over that earlier painting with black.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
You can see this was, he hadn't seen this information before now, so you're seeing Glenn's.
Why would I have done that, though?
Well, and indeed, our senior paintings conservator, Jay Kruger, has said that usually when an artist paints over an earlier work, they paint over it in white.
Right. Yeah, so you get a sort of fresh ground to start on.
Right.
Let's not make too much of that. But it's interesting.
No, I think it's interesting.
We're actually going to make quite a bit of it.
Okay. It might have just been the paint that was in the studio, but it's strange to paint it over in black and then to put a white ground on top of that. That makes no sense.
Well, or maybe it makes, I don't know, maybe it's more metaphorical or purposeful.
You know what I think is under that painting is, at that time I was doing still lifes and sort of abstract paintings, but still lifes from photos of African sculptures.
Yes.
So that might be what's under there.
Okay. Well,
Or it could just be an abstraction that I didn't like.
So here are some earlier examples of
Right.
your, on the right, your abstract work, purely abstract, and then other work that has text in it,
Right.
that precedes the abstract work. So we were wondering if it might be something like one of these works, but we're just all guessing.
Well, I would say the I'm a Man painting that's a very small painting, the one on the right, the abstraction, and that was about the size that I was working at. So if I was working on an abstract painting that's the size of the I'm a Man painting, which is, I think, 40 by 25, something like that, it would have been very ambitious for me, which was probably why it didn't work. So it's possible that it's an abstraction. And I think most of the work that I was doing that was sort of figurative, these sort of still lives, I sort of destroyed them. So it's hard to tell.
Yeah, we will never know.
Well, yeah, but interesting.
We went further. One thing I wanted to ask you about was this idea of painting signs. And we're going to talk more fully about that as we go. But one of your great artistic heroes has been, and particularly at this time, was de Kooning. And this is a painting, Zot, that was at the Met. And you talk about other images. You talk about Pirate in particular by de Kooning that was at MoMA. You've written about that.
Right.
But Zot, in terms of this, all over and kind of writing and the black and white of the oil and the enamel, which de Kooning so famously used as a sign painter and then brought it into his artistic practice.
Oh, it's definitely coming from that. And this is a painting I would have seen because I went to after-school classes at the Met when I was in high school. So I would have seen that painting before Pirate. Pirate's from '85. So the timing is, having seen this work is definitely an influence on the I'm a Man painting.
So our conservation scientist, John Delaney, together with Jay Kruger, did some more work, and they did these infrared images. They made these infrared images of the I'm a Man. And because the work is so highly contrasted, black and white, they sought to isolate the white, starting out with, and that's what you see here, they're isolating the white in the image on the right, and ignore the striations, the horizontal lines. It's simply a part of the process of the imaging. But the imaging reveals a varied application of the mix of oil and enamel, which is what you use to paint this work. So it's very interesting to see all the work and the mix and the evidence of the paste from the oil, and then the drips from the enamel revealed here. And here is a detail where you can see a lot of the rigorous brushwork that was going into the making of this painting.
Well, it's funny because it's trying to put together two incompatible mediums, oil and enamel, and but also I think two incompatible ways of making marks. The oil paint is quite, I think, was quite stiff. It requires a lot of, not effort, but requires, kind of brushing it. The enamel paint just wants to go everywhere. It's very liquid. And when the two things meet, they create these sort of weird interactions that you couldn't quite control. And it's funny to think about sort of making a sign with, I think I was using Sign Painter's enamel, household enamel, but then making a painting, quote unquote, with oil paint. So I sort of hadn't put those two things together, whether this was a sign or whether it was a painting. And so I sort of, maybe that's part of I'm conjecturing here, part of what that combination of materials was about.
Well, but of course it is based on a sign.
Right.
I don't know if we,
Should we go forward?
maybe just for 1 second. Yeah, so it's based on the famous sign that the sanitation workers carried in Memphis in the spring of 1968, declaring that they were human beings, using this very simple sign vocabulary to try to get better wages and to be treated more decently as sanitation workers. And so that's an actual sign, and you take that actual sign and you turn it into a painting. So the sign painter, the sign source is absolutely explicitly there.
Right.
And it's really interesting to hear you say that you wanted to stage that in terms of medium, not just in terms of image, but facture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think, things one does in the studio are often unconscious, and I can talk about it now, but I don't know at the time I was really thinking through that so concretely. But I would say that the painting, when I made it, I knew it was important in terms of kind of, I guess, thinking more about what a painting can do, like what its purpose, what it can say. And that was a sort of important turning point, that sort of, I knew that, that this painting was important, and that's why it remained in the studio until it ended up out in the hallway there,
Well, parenthetically, it's lovely that you chose this museum for that breakthrough piece. We're thrilled.
Well, there were, thanks to both of you for even suggesting that it come here, because it was a very important painting to me. I had a lot of places that were interested in it, but none of them really made sense. But this as a sort of repository, where people can come in for free and things go on the wall immediately, and stay up. And also the company, the Synecdoche piece, the sort of skin panel pieces by Byron Kim, that's in the space out there too. He's one of my closest friends, and so the proximity to that piece, we sort of grew up as artists, in a way. So there's a lot of, besides, Synecdoche, Byron Kim's piece, there's also a lot of other good company out there. So, now
and also
this
is the nation's museum, and this
Exactly.
is a very significant work about American history.
Right.
And that was part of its appeal for us.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just quickly go through the rest of this. This is where the black is optimized. So you can see, although the blacks look opaque on the painting, you can see the actual brushwork that is going into this with the enamel. In the case of the lettering, was all enamel paint. And it was stenciled. And you can kind of see this. This is it's a color image, but they've tinted it with green, so you can really see the white in the brushstrokes. And
you can see the pencil lines.
Hang on. Yes, you can see the pencil lines where you stenciled.
Why was I so sloppy then? Well, that's interesting, actually, because I'm taking the image, the source image is a printed, it's a piece of cardboard that's been printed on. It's very precise. And so I'm not doing that, So I think it's, in a way, it's sloppiness, even where the letters are. Partially it's because the ground is too hard to paint over in a precise way, It's got too many bumps and ridges. So if I had done this painting all in enamel, I probably would have had a very smooth surface. And so the letters that were stenciled on top of the white paint, if the white paint were all enamel, it would be very easy to do smooth lettering. But so the ground itself sort of prevented the letters from being perfect. But I think also I was thinking about Johns, as well as, I'm thinking about de Kooning. So I'm thinking about him using letter stencils and pushing oil paint through letter stencils and how imprecise that process is. And I sort of am inspired by that kind of impreciseness. But I think also conceptually, that impreciseness is something to do with what I'm trying to say about that image.
Just to go to the condition report, prints, which you had commissioned a condition report
Right.
to be done on this painting because it was showing signs of cracking. And
Well, in some ways, you know, a lot of things happen because you're just someplace and you see something and you think that might be a fun thing to do. So I have a good friend who's a painting conservator. He works at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and his name is Michael Duffy. He's a very nice guy, very modest. And whenever I sort of ask, can I come see what he's working on? He's very gracious, lets me come. And Michael's the kind of guy where he just will walk you into their conservation studio and say, oh yeah, I'm just working on some Picasso. And you walk in and it's the Demoiselles, And he's like, I'm working on that, I'm just working on some Picasso. So I was in his studio, and on his desk he had an image of a Jasper Johns painting with all this writing all over it. It was like a color Xerox with all this writing over it. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, oh, it's a condition report. Whenever something comes into the museum and we're thinking of acquiring it, it comes to the conservation lab, and we do a condition report, sort of trying to address all the kind of problems or cracking or sort of conservation issues that might be addressed. And when he said it, I just thought, well, I've got this painting, could you do one? And he's like, well, I'm not supposed to work outside of MoMA, And I was like, come on. They won't know. So he produced this condition report for me. And so all this notation about the cracking of the hairline cracks and scattered brown droplets and all that stuff is from Michael's notations on the surface about the painting and kind of what conservation issues there were.
And when you asked him to do this, did you intend to make a work of art out of the condition report itself?
No. Well, yeah, I don't know if it was a work of art. It was just something fun to do. He did it on a color Xerox, and I think maybe it was in a show just as that thing, a color Xerox that Michael had written on. But then I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to do an edition out of this. And so that's what, these prints sort of came from. But that was a little bit later, maybe a year later, or more, actually, maybe a little longer than that.
And conceptually, how do you think about, the condition report and the painting? I mean, Glenn was so generous that when we acquired the painting, he gave us the condition report print to accompany it.
Well, I think, one of the things I was interested in the painting is that the combination of oil and enamel paint is unstable. It started cracking immediately, because oil and enamel dry at different rates, and so it was always kind of like a wreck, caveat emptor. But it's here, and you have this fabulous conservation lab, so you can stabilize it. But that was interesting to me, that it was from the beginning a kind of fraught object, that it was kind of, in some ways, changing and decomposing. And I sort of thought about it as a, sort of in a relationship to the sign it was based on, thinking about history as not this static thing, but as this process, and that the painting is engaged in this process. And so the moment of 1968, when you think about that march, these strikers, sanitation workers striking, carrying these signs that say, I'm a man, it's hard to imagine that sort of march happening now. Because I think our ideas about, our ideas about masculinity, our ideas about justice, the history of race relations in this country, lots of things have changed. And so for me, the process of that painting somehow embodying this process that you make an image and it sort of starts doing something out of your control is sort of about the process of history for me too.
And the layering.
And the layering, exactly. And I mean, I guess, okay, the black paint underneath. So I guess one could say also that, there's a hidden image under there, which is also somehow about history, too, about how certain kinds of moments appear and disappear, go in and out of our focus as a nation. I remember doing a show in Memphis, and we showed, I think this was in a catalog, this image by Ernest Withers was in a catalog that I had, and I showed it to a collector in Memphis. Elliot Perry, a fantastic basketball player, retired, sports commentator, and a fantastic collector in Memphis. And I gave him this catalog, and it had this image in it. And I remember he ran back to the car that I was in and said, "That's my grandfather." And he had never seen that photo. It was amazing to me that someone who'd lived in Memphis, had never seen that photo. But the guy walking across in the front was his grandfather. So I just thought it was an amazing kind of moment where you realize, no, we don't know everything, if you think about certain kinds of moments, you think you know everything, you don't. And the interesting thing about this photo is there's a big article in the New York Times a couple of years ago about Ernest Withers, the photographer who took this photo, and it turns out he was a paid FBI informant.
Yep.
So think about that. Iconic images of the civil rights movement done by someone who was also a paid FBI informant.
Given access.
Right.
To photograph the civil rights movement and at the same time reporting
Friends
on the activities.
with all the leaders of the movement.
Yeah.
Would photograph images like this, but also photograph license plate numbers on their cars. Amazing.
Indeed.
Amazing. Which just tells you that, this has just come out recently, in the last couple of years. And so it's just sort of thinking about history as this process, more and more things come out. Our interpretations of these moments change, and that kind of embodying that in the painting is something I was interested in, and the condition report prints sort of speak to that too.
We noticed there are two versions of the, I think there are two versions of the
Yes.
poster, and in the image of Builder Levy, another photographer of the period, it's the one that's your picture
Has the same
is closer to.
orientation.
Right.
Yeah. So we were just curious. The Withers is the most famous image of that poster, and
Right.
one of the most famous images of that period. But you chose the other for your image.
It seemed more face-like, I think. More, this is sort of a weird thing to say, but it's very strong for me. It's more Halloween-like in some ways. It's more like a carved pumpkin. It's a very strange thing to say in relationship to this image, but somehow making it anthropomorphic was interesting to me, and the way this text appears on the sign seemed more anthropomorphic to me.
Well, your work is about about a lot of things, but one thing it's very much about is how we look at text, how we read text in multiple ways. So a text that might invoke anthropomorphic imagery would be one way of rethinking what a text could look like.
Mm-hmm. And the early paintings, the paintings that came right after this, were paintings using texts that always said had the word "I" in them. They were on door-sized panels, and door-sized panels for me are obviously scaled for the human body. So that this painting I think, even though it's not scaled for the body, well, maybe it is, because it's sort of based on this sign, which is scaled for the body. It has to be small enough to be worn, So it does have a body reference, even in its scale, as well as in the text, But the paintings that come after that are much more explicit about that.
And you had seen this actual sign. You were inspired by the actual sign you had seen in Charles Rangel's
Right, one of
office.
those class trips, where you go visit the, still in office, kind of amazing. Went to visit his office on 125th Street, and there was this sign in a frame on a wall. And I knew nothing about the sign. But it just kept staring at it. Was fascinated by it. So knowledge of what the context was came much later. But the image was very strong. And I think, strangely enough, although most of my work is text-based, I would say in some ways it's image-based too. because it's not like I go trolling through books looking for text to make paintings out of. I'll hit upon a sentence in a text and it'll stay in my head, you know, just over and over, sometimes for years, and then something will come out of it.
So you said you had seen it in a class trip. How old were you when you saw it and then made it?
Well, I think 16, 17, probably.
So you hung on to that for...
Yeah, it took a long
time.
Well, I wasn't an artist then, you know.
Still.
I wanted to be an architect, but then I came to my senses.
I might want to get back to that question of history. And so I Am a Man is a painting about history. It's a history painting. And then, as you suggested, there's the history of the painting, which the condition report thematizes, that that painting has its own history, even as it's reflecting back on history. And to think of you as a history painter, we tend to think of history painters as figurative, that tradition, and you're dealing with history with text and sometimes with numbers. You're counting paintings. The other really significant painting about the civil rights period we might think of course, is the Warhol work from '63, painted at the time of. And then we might think about a generation of artists who are born in the late 50s, 60s, early 70s, your generation, my generation, who are making works about that period. Carrie Marshall has done civil rights memory paintings, people who were children then. So there's something very interesting that Warhol's doing it at the moment of, and that many, many years later, people who were children then, you're 8 years old when the strike happens, are looking back to the period of childhood. And I'm interested that you're really the first, I think, in that painting to do it, because a lot of that work is made in the 90s or in the past 10 years. But I Am a Man is 1988. You're quite young. You're 28 when you're making a painting about what was happening when you're a child. And I was just curious if you were drawn particularly to that period, and the history in your art is triggered by that period, by that moment, the civil rights period when you're a child. I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
Well, I think, partially it's just, at the time I started making work, it was important to me to make works about what I considered unfinished business. And so the sort of mining the history of the civil rights movement, the history of racial relations in our country was a sort of an important content for me, among other contents. But I think also by the time I was making paintings like the I'm a Man painting, I was looking at someone like Robert Colescott or people who are also, an older generation, but also dealing with the history of, this country, particularly around race relations. But I was looking at Warhol, certainly, because I was interested in, not that I was making work with images, but I was interested in how you deal with repetition, because a lot of my work does deal with repetition, but also how you deal with sort of all sorts of other issues too. He was a kind of touchstone. But often I think, sometimes the artists that you're inspired by are the artists whose work you don't make anything that looks like, or, like I love Richard Serra. Besides the fact that we both use oil stick, our work doesn't look anything alike, But the materiality of his work, the monumentality of his work, all those things are interesting to me.
So then there's the history of the painting itself, which you thematize in Condition Report. So do we read that painting differently than we might have read it in 1988, i.e., have things changed? First of all, 1988 marks a big change from 1968. But then in 2013, how do we read your painting? Has its meaning changed?
I don't know. I think, one of the interesting things is that every generation reads things like these cultural objects differently, depending on kind of what they're bringing to it. Obviously, I remember doing a lecture kind of in this kind of setting once, and someone asking me like, "Oh, well, black and white text, white grounds with black text," and I'm, well, clearly that's about racial relations in our country, and I sort of had to say, well, it's also about this, like the newspaper, black text on white paper, it's like Xeroxing, it's kind of like normal, If the text were pink, that would be a very different thing.
It's the condition of legibility.
Yeah, and so it was interesting to me that it always got read through those binaries of, black and white race relations. And maybe it gets read less that way now, or maybe more, given who's in the White House. So I don't know, but I think that's, if the work's any good, it can remain open to other possibilities,
Just see what else we put up here, and just some other works by Glenn that are thinking very much about time and about history. We looked at these oil stick gouaches where you count from the Revolutionary Declaration of Independence, 1776, to 1865, and then 1865 to the year of painting, right, 1991.
Yeah.
So you're kind of counting time, counting history, in a very kind of blatant and obvious, and therefore not obvious at all way.
I think it's so funny when you see images you haven't seen in a long time, certain things come up. And I remember this interview with James Baldwin where, I don't even remember, maybe Dick Cavett Show, if anyone remembers Dick Cavett Show, but he was talking with somebody. It wasn't Dick Cavett, but it was someone else. Maybe it was even like William Buckley. Is that possible? William Buckley Jr. had a talk show? I think so. Anyway, they were talking. And the question of time came up in relationship to civil rights, We need more time. And Baldwin, in his sort of supremely kind of Queenie way, which I love, says, you've taken my great-grandfather's time, my grandfather's time, my father's time. How much more time do you want, And I think that's where this comes from. Time, basically, like the time between important moments in this country, 1776 and 1865, and between 1865 and the present of that drawing, this. And I'm sort of, in a way, not making any commentary. I'm just marking the dates,
And that's an important distinction to make. It's about this
But the dates
country.
are loaded.
Yeah.
It's not 1778,
But it's all American history.
Yeah, it's all American history, exactly.
And the work we
Speaking of which,
are lucky to have now. So the theme of America runs throughout the work?
A lot of times, yeah, but this was actually based on Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, in some ways, and Caspar David Friedrich's paintings. So there are actually two neons that are put together. There were two separate pieces that I put together. The one on top was called Rugen Figure. And I don't speak German, so I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. But it's a figure that you often see in paintings, particularly in Friedrich's paintings, of a figure seen from behind that's looking at a landscape or a seascape. So you're looking at the back of a figure that's in a painting, and that figure is looking at something that you can also see that's beyond a landscape that's beyond you. And I became really interested in that kind of that figure, what that figure might mean. So that's sort of where that top piece came from. So if you imagine, you don't see the bottom piece, so imagine that the top America is its own piece. And it is actually backwards. But it's backwards in a weird way, because I was playing around on the computer with the word America, and and I'm terrible on the computer. So I was doing one of those things in Photoshop where you flip something horizontally or vertically, and then I got all confused. And suddenly the word America was there, but it was weird. And I was like, what's wrong with it? And I realized, oh, it's backwards, but because some of the words are symmetrical, bilaterally symmetrical, they seem to still be forward. And that's where that piece came from. So it is literally turned to the wall, you know? So you're seeing the back of the piece. And it's painted black on the front, which has been turned towards the wall, you know? So when you actually look at it in the lobby, you'll see that there's black paint on it. The bottom piece was based on another version of an American neon, just the word America, but with an animation. It flashed off and on in this really annoying manner that kind of drove you out of the room. So I just flipped that, let me think, horizontally? Yeah, I flipped it horizontally, so it's upside down, and then stuck those two pieces together. But so the one on the bottom seems to be a mirror of the top, but it isn't. So it's very, you know, people have a hard time with it. The neon fabricators are all kind of dyslexic. This was like a nightmare for them. Total. In fact, well, I'm never going to tell that story. Let us just say that the crate was full and somebody looked at the letters and they're like, oh my God, we've got it backwards. And they had to remake some of the letters because they weren't backwards in the right way. Anyway.
Well,
Here's your Johns.
We're art historians, so we didn't know about Caspar David Friedrich, but
No.
we certainly thought of Johns and his
big
double flags and his
influence,
double maps.
Yep.
And could you possibly speak a little bit about Johns? I know that you have before, but I think we'd all be interested in that.
Well, what's interesting, he says, like, somewhere in his writings, he says, take an object, do something to it, do something else to it. And I thought, well, what if the object's a word, not an object, but a word? What can one do to a word? And so that's kind of where these neons come from, is that kind of taking one thing and kind of playing with it over and over again, trying to articulate it differently. But also I love his maps. The stencils, all my use of stencils comes from Johns, so there it is, Took me a long time to find a Times Roman that kind of looked like that, and it isn't even really like that in my paintings, but that's where it comes from. But yeah, there are dozens of variations on these kinds of mapping pieces, that I've looked at, over and over again. And it's funny because I think he thinks, he says it's, a map is something the mind, image of the United States, it's something the mind already knows in some ways. It's like a target or numbers, you already know that thing. But it's such a loaded image, For it means so, if he were living in France and making these paintings, it would mean something totally different. So it in a way, they're, mind already knows them, but in another way, they're quite charged and loaded, and it depends on whose hands they're in, So that's one of the things I'm interested in,
And the word America for you
right.
is...
It comes up a lot. It's in the
similarly.
work, literally, but it's in the work as a subject matter over and over again.
Right. And one thing about the blackened paint, the painted side, which to explain is it darkens out the light. It blocks the light so that on the top register, if I have it right, the top register, it doesn't reflect on the wall, and vice versa on the bottom.
Right.
Or is it the other way around?
It's so confusing. But I mentioned Dickens, and
Yeah,
when I
that's
was
right.
saying Tale of Two Cities, the famous paragraph, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I was trying to make a piece about that, and I could never really figure out what that was. But the first America piece was in, I think, 2006, different administration, same war. So I was thinking about America as this place where, our economy was good then, and it's so-so now. We were in a war, we're still in a war, like the kind of ambivalence of this moment that we're living through seemed to me what Dickens was talking about in this fiction, but we were living through, this kind of height and bottom at the same time. And so that's kind of where all the American neons came from, this kind of shining light that's eclipsed at the same time,
Yeah,
there and not there.
in a
you know?
work that was made in 2012.
Right. But also this sort of weird, beacon thing that we love, shining light
It's
of
a
America.
marquee. It's
yeah,
another
it's a marquee.
sign.
It's a
another
marquee.
sign.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of just playing on those variations in this.
So we thought, sort of for the final sequence, we might just want to look at the painting again and think about it for the rest of your work, what it generates in your work and your reflections on language. And one thing that really strikes me about it is it's so direct, so explicit, so clear, that then, of course, it becomes mysterious and unclear. The Viennese critic Karl Kraus said that the longer you stare at a word, the stranger it becomes. So even though it's so direct, of course, then it becomes more opaque. And when we think about what happens with your work and the way you really literally explore opacity, even though they look so different, what happens afterwards, it seems as if that reflection on language and the opacity of the sign is really kicked off in that work.
I mean, I think, this is an interesting image to show in relationship to that thought, because the text paintings that are made kind of using a technique of putting oil stick, sort of waxy oil crayon through letter stencil, starting at the top, going to the bottom of the image, and sort of, as I'm using the stencil, it's picking up this oil paint on the back. And the more letters I make, the more oil is deposited on the surface, and the letters start to bleed out, basically, and kind of become indistinct. And so it's sort of the act of writing a text that makes it disappear. This is an interesting image because it's, in a way, the opposite, because it's an etching. And so if I were working with oil stick on a piece of paper, one pass would get you all of that. But working on an etching, you have to put all of that in, So it was sort of like, and it was interesting because it was, these are from '92. This was like the hardest work I'd ever made, because it's just like, everything that's spontaneous and natural about the process of using this stencil is now faked. I have to keep it. If I make a mark, you have to work to keep it, if people know about the etching process. So it was really interesting to labor to make this disappearance, Totally different process, but totally fascinating in that way.
It uses the I that you were talking about,
right.
that you started using after I Am a Man.
And in some ways, I think, working on these prints sort of got me thinking more about working with collaborators, because this printmaker has become a collaborator in the way that the neon guys have become collaborators. They think through the work as we're making it. It's not just like I go down there and here's the sketch, make it. It gets thought through with them. And so this process of trying to think through how do you save the disappearance, that's going to happen by making an etching, which is very different than the disappearance that just happens by the process of using a letter stencil and messy paint. Was really fascinating to me.
There's this stereotype about prints that they are secondary. The painting comes first, the print after.
Right.
Edition works are cost less, so therefore they are less. And what you're telling us is, in fact, making this print forced you in a way to rethink your process, or
this
challenged
was months
you.
of work, basically, where a painting, a painting that size could be done in a day, 2 days. Was I supposed to say that? Anyway.
And of course, your coal dust
Yeah.
pictures. And Molly, of course, is a great Warholian.
I've been dying to ask you ever since I was working on Warhol and looking at your work and saw it in the Whitney retrospective and knew it beforehand. But it always struck me that the coal dust related somehow to the diamond dust.
Oh, yeah, direct ripoff. Because I was talking to a printer we were working on silk screens, and I was telling him about a project that I wanted to make that I was making these oil stick paintings, and I thought, oh, I want to work with this James Baldwin text, but James Baldwin's a boy preacher, and if you read his writings, you know, it's very elaborate sentences, very long, very dense, very weighty. And I just thought, the oil stick isn't quite getting it, so I want to figure out something I can add to that material to make it literally more weighty, you know. And the printer said, oh, you know, well, we're doing these diamond dust things, and that, copyright infringement, you know, like Warhol's already done that. It's kind of, and then he said, oh, there's this other stuff called Magnum. And like, Magnum, he's like, it's coal dust. And he didn't even have to show it to me. It was perfect, you know.
Yeah,
because also it's a
coal.
waste product too, you know. It's leftover from coal processing. It's used for sandblasting. And I sort of like the idea of this stuff that's kind of like left on the side of the road, kind of being brought into the space of art. Because that's a lot of what Baldwin talks about as, you know, he says kind of like from the space of the disesteemed, you know, a very Baldwin word, is the place that, you know, one can most clearly view as a society. It's not from the top, it's from the bottom, you know. And he made use of that position, you know, in his writing. And so the idea of coal dust for me being this waste product that you transport into the space of art was, you know, kind of what that's about. Also with its kind of literal weight, you know. But back to the sort of issue about things you see and don't see, what the coal dust also does is make those letters much harder to read. So they become more materialized and less distinct at the same time. So there's always, in my work, a lot of this back and forth between things that seem very, they're letters, you know, but they disappear, you know.
I think we've got an image where, yeah, it really is so opaque.
Right, right. And there's an image under there of a march that was here in Washington, Million Man March. It's underneath that. There's a whole series of drawings that had different layers of image and text from Baldwin, from Malcolm X, all sorts of people.
Well, you say you rip off Warhol and you rip off the stencil from Johns, but honestly, your work is so different, and I don't, in a way, see those sources ultimately at all. It becomes its own thing, obviously, in the work.
Well, hopefully.
Absolutely. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Thanks for coming.
Glenn.